So you're probably wondering how a brand new Porsche Cayenne ended up looking like a crumpled soda can, embedded nose first in what appeared to be a particularly robust section of my privet hedge. Well, settle in, because this isn't just a story about property damage. It's a tale of HOA tyranny, vehicular vengeance, and the beautiful, satisfying solidity of well-placed concrete. It all started with a simple desire for privacy, and a woman named Clarissa Thorne, who seemed to believe that her luxury SUV gave her rights that superseded local ordinances, common courtesy, and the structural integrity of my landscaping. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thinks she owns the world, you'll know exactly where this is headed. A glorious, well-deserved collision with reality, or in this case, reinforced concrete. It began, as these things often do, quite subtly, almost deniably. I'd moved into this lovely little cul-de-sac neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, about 2 years prior. My house was at the curve of the cul-de-sac, and one of the property lines ran alongside a lesser-used access path that connected to the main road, a shortcut primarily used by pedestrians or cyclists. I'd cultivated a thick, lush privet hedge along that entire boundary, my pride and joy, meticulously watered, fed, and trimmed. It wasn't just for aesthetics, it was for privacy, a green screen that buffered my yard from the path and the occasional prying eyes from the main road. It represented a significant investment of time and money, and frankly, I loved the secluded feel it gave my garden. The problem wasn't the path itself, but Clarissa Thorne's interpretation of its accessibility. Clarissa, our HOA treasurer and a woman whose personality was as sharp and unyielding as her professionally maintained bob, lived 3 houses down. She drove a pristine, almost offensively white Porsche Cayenne, which she polished more often than she interacted pleasantly with her neighbors. One afternoon, I noticed a peculiar indentation in the hedge, a couple of snapped branches, and what looked suspiciously like tire tracks veering off the very edge of the access path and cutting across the corner of my lawn through the thinnest part of the hedge to get onto the main road a few seconds faster. I frowned, repaired the damage, and initially chalked it up to a careless delivery driver or a wayward teenager. Oh, how naive I was. The next week, it happened again. This time, more pronounced. The damage was more significant, a clear flattening, a definite vehicular assault. My blood pressure started a slow, steady climb. I'd seen Clarissa's Porsche taking that route once or twice when I was out walking, and a dreadful suspicion began to form. She was treating the very edge of my property as an extension of the public thoroughfare, a personal off-ramp to shave perhaps 5 seconds off her commute. I decided on a gentle approach first. I saw her at the community mailbox the following day, her designer sunglasses perched perfectly. "Clarissa," I began, trying to keep my tone light, "I've noticed some damage to my hedge along the access path. Looks like a car's been cutting the corner pretty sharply there. I was just wondering if you'd seen anything." She gave me a slow, evaluative look, the kind that makes you feel like you're a slightly annoying insect. "The hedge?" she said, her voice dripping with carefully cultivated indifference. "Can't say I have. People are so careless these days, aren't they?" And with a flick of her wrist, she retrieved her mail and glided back to her Cayenne, leaving me standing there feeling like I'd just been expertly gaslighted. The damage continued, almost like clockwork, every few days. The corner of my hedge was becoming a permanent wreck. I'd repair it, replant smaller bushes, and they'd be mown down before they could even take root. The audacity was breathtaking. It wasn't just the damage, it was the contempt it implied. My property, my efforts, were beneath her consideration. The passive-aggressive denial phase didn't last long. Soon, the corner cutting became a daily ritual for Clarissa. My hedge, once a proud sentinel of green, now had a perpetually ragged, chewed-up section that I simply couldn't repair fast enough. My gentle reminders had been dismissed, so I decided to try a more direct approach. I caught her one morning, just as she was angling her Porsche for its usual, destructive shortcut. I stepped out onto my lawn, right near the point of impact, forcing her to actually stop, though she did so with an irritated sigh and a roll of her eyes visible even through the tinted windshield. "Clarissa," I said, trying to keep the tremor of anger out of my voice, We need to talk about this. You're driving through my hedge almost every day now. You're destroying my property. She lowered her window a few inches, the scent of expensive perfume wafting out. Oh, are those your bushes? She asked, with a theatrical display of dawning comprehension that was utterly unconvincing. They're so close to the path. I just assumed it was common verge. It's barely a few branches, really. Barely a few branches? I wanted to scream. It was a 10-foot section of carefully cultivated growth, now looking like a mangy dog's backside. It's my property, Clarissa, I stated firmly. And it's not a road. Please stop driving over it. She gave a little laugh, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. Honestly, some people are so precious about their little gardens. It's hardly the end of the world. Besides, she added, her eyes narrowing slightly, as HOA treasurer, I'm quite familiar with the community guidelines. As long as I'm not impeding emergency access, which I am clearly not, it's a minor neighborhood transit adjustment. She then gunned the engine slightly, a clear dismissal, and without waiting for a response, cranked her wheel hard and drove right over the already mauled section of my hedge, a little smirk playing on her lips. I was left standing there, fuming, covered in a fine spray of dirt and shredded leaves. My neighbors, particularly old Mr. Henderson from across the street, had witnessed this little exchange with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. He later told me that Clarissa, she's always been a terror, thinks that HOA badge gives her a crown. I realized then that reasoning with her was futile. She was drunk on her perceived power, armored by her expensive car and her HOA title. My next step was, logically, the HOA itself. I typed up a formal complaint, complete with dated photographs of the damage and a summary of my interaction with Clarissa. I submitted it to the HOA board, hoping for some semblance of impartial justice. The response I got a week later was a masterclass in bureaucratic buck-passing and thinly veiled support for one of their own. It was a letter signed by the HOA president, a nervous-looking man named Gerald who Clarissa clearly had wrapped around her little finger. The letter stated, and I quote, "The board has reviewed your concerns regarding landscaping near the community access path. Ms. Thorne has assured the board that any passage near your property line is undertaken with utmost care and consideration for community transit flow. We encourage neighbors to resolve such minor landscaping disagreements amicably and remind all residents that clearly demarcated property lines must be respected." It was a joke. They were essentially telling me to talk to the person destroying my property, who had already made it clear she didn't care, and then vaguely mentioning property lines as if I were the one confused. The implication was clear. Clarissa was untouchable, and my hedge was her problem, not theirs. The phrase, community transit flow, particularly irked me. This wasn't a congested highway, it was a quiet cul-de-sac, and she was the only one creating this flow through my shrubbery. I felt my frustration solidifying into a cold, hard knot of determination. If the established channels wouldn't help, I'd have to find another way. The insult wasn't just the damaged hedge anymore. It was the smug, dismissive attitude of Clarissa and the spinelessness of the HOA that enabled her. They had fundamentally misunderstood. I wasn't just some precious gardener. I was a homeowner with rights, and I was getting exceedingly tired of being pushed around. The image of her smirking face as she deliberately drove over my plants was seared into my mind. That smirk, I vowed, would be wiped off. The HOA's pathetic response was the spark that lit the fire of true pro-revenge under me. My blood was boiling, but I knew I had to be smart, methodical. Ranting and raving wouldn't fix my hedge or teach Clarissa a lesson. I started documenting everything. I bought a discreet trail cam and mounted it on a tree overlooking the path and the corner of my hedge. The footage it captured was infuriatingly consistent. Every weekday morning, Clarissa's white Porsche would approach, not even slowing down, and take its familiar destructive shortcut. Sometimes, if she thought no one was watching, she'd even seem to aim for a particularly vulnerable-looking new shoot, a tiny act of horticultural malice. I saved every video clip, backed them up religiously. I also started a detailed log: date, time, extent of damage, estimated cost of replacement plants. I was building a case, though at this point, I wasn't sure exactly who I was building it for. The police? A civil suit? Or perhaps, just for my own sanity, to prove I wasn't imagining the sheer, unadulterated entitlement. I even tried calling the non-emergency police line once, after a particularly egregious episode where she'd taken out a newly planted rhododendron. An officer did come, looked at the muddy tire tracks, listened to my story, and then sighed. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "it's private property. Unless she's making threats or causing thousands of dollars in damage at once, it's really a civil matter, or something for your HOA to handle." When I mentioned the HOA's response, he gave a knowing grimace. "Yeah, HOAs can be tricky. Honestly, your best bet is probably small claims court if you want to recoup damages, but that won't stop her if she's determined." Small claims court sounded like a lot of hassle for what would ultimately be a slap on the wrist, and as the officer pointed out, it wouldn't physically prevent her from continuing. No, I needed a more permanent solution. My mind started to whirl with possibilities. Spikes? Too aggressive, definitely illegal, and would look terrible. A traditional fence? The HOA had rules about fence height and materials visible from the street, and knowing Clarissa, she'd probably claim it was an unapproved structure and have the HOA demand I take it down, even if it was technically on my land. The sheer injustice of it all was galling. She was the one breaking rules and damaging property, yet I was the one who had to jump through hoops. It was during one late-night research session, scrolling through landscaping forums and property law websites, that the seed of an idea began to sprout. I was looking at ways to reinforce a hedge from within, perhaps with a sturdy wire mesh, when I stumbled upon a discussion about retaining walls hidden by foliage. What if the barrier wasn't just mesh, but something substantial, something that wouldn't just discourage, but would actively, physically, and very suddenly stop her? My property line was clearly demarcated on my survey documents, which I'd pored over. The hedge was planted about 6 inches inside my property line, giving me a little buffer. What I did within that 6 inches, as long as it wasn't an eyesore from the street or violated specific height restrictions for fences, and this wouldn't strictly be a fence in the conventional sense, was my business. I started researching low-profile concrete barriers, bollards, and decorative landscape walling. The key was that it had to be completely invisible from her approach angle, hidden within the existing bulk of the hedge, but utterly, immovably solid. It couldn't look like a trap. It had to look like my hedge had suddenly developed an iron will, or rather, an iron core. I grinned. The thought of Clarissa's shocked face, the image of her precious Porsche meeting an unyielding obstacle it never saw coming, was immensely satisfying. The legal angle was important. I needed to ensure that if, or rather when, she hit it, I wouldn't be liable. It was on my property. She would be trespassing by vehicle to hit it, and as long as it wasn't designed to be inherently dangerous in a booby trap kind of way, like projecting spikes at her. I should be clear, this wasn't about causing injury. It was about property protection and a very firm lesson in boundaries. The more I thought about it, the more perfect the plan seemed. It was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its potential impact. The next step was to consult someone who knew about construction. My old college buddy, Mike, ran a small landscaping and construction business. He was just the person to talk to. Practical, creative, and with a healthy disregard for officious HOA types. I called Mike and laid out the whole sordid tale, from the initial subtle damage to Clarissa's smug dismissals and the HOA's complicity. He listened patiently, occasionally chuckling or letting out a low whistle of disbelief at Clarissa's sheer audacity. "So," I concluded, "I'm thinking of building something inside the hedge line. Something solid, very solid, like a low concrete wall or reinforced concrete posts, completely hidden by the existing foliage." Mike was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Man, that's brilliant," he finally said, a grin evident in his voice. A stealth retaining wall, essentially. To retain your sanity and the structural integrity of your Porsche-repelling hedge. I love it. As long as it's entirely on your property, and you're not building it ridiculously high or out of prohibited materials by HOA covenant for structures, you should be golden. If it's concealed within the hedge, how would they even know until the moment of truth? We discussed the practicalities. The section of hedge Clarissa targeted was about 10 to 12 feet long, the corner she cut. We didn't need to reinforce the whole property line, just that specific, abused stretch. Mike suggested using concrete blocks, the kind used for foundational work, perhaps 2 courses high, filled with rebar and more concrete for extra strength. He estimated it would be about 18 to 24 inches high, low enough to be completely hidden by the lower, denser branches of the privet, but high enough to meet the bumper and undercarriage of a Porsche Cayenne with significant resistance. The key, Mike emphasized, is making sure it's set back from your absolute property line by an inch or two, just to be pedantic if she tries to claim it's encroaching. And we need to build it without making a huge mess that attracts attention. Can you thin out the inside of that section of hedge temporarily to give us working room, without making it look sparse from the street or from her usual approach? I assured him I could. I'd become quite adept at hedge management, thanks to Clarissa's ongoing pruning efforts. We talked about sourcing the materials. Mike said he could get the blocks, rebar, and bags of concrete mix at a trade discount. He even offered to lend me his heavy-duty cement mixer and some tools, and more importantly, his expertise and a strong back for a weekend. Consider it a public service, he quipped. One less Porsche driving menace terrorizing innocent shrubbery. Before proceeding, I did one last round of due diligence. I triple-checked my property survey. I reread the HOA covenants, specifically looking for any clauses about internal property fortifications or landscape support structures. There were plenty of rules about visible fences, sheds, and tree houses, but nothing about reinforcing a hedge from within, especially if it wasn't visible. The covenants were all about maintaining the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood from the outside. What was hidden inside your own landscaping, on your own property, didn't seem to be covered. Perfect. I also mentally ran through the worst-case scenarios. If Clarissa hit it, she'd undoubtedly cause a scene. She'd scream. She'd threaten. She'd try to blame me. The police would likely be called. But as long as the structure was entirely on my property, built safely, not designed to impale or electrocute, for example, and she was technically trespassing with her vehicle by driving off the designated path and onto my land to hit it, the legal ramifications should fall squarely on her. It would be an accident caused by her own reckless driving on private property. The delicious irony was not lost on me. She was using her HOA position to feel powerful, and I was using the HOA's own loosely written rules, or lack thereof for my specific plan, and property law against her. The plan was solidified. Mike and I set a date 2 weekends out. He suggested we do it early on a Saturday and Sunday morning when there was less neighborhood activity. I would spend the intervening time carefully pruning the inside of that section of hedge, creating a narrow workspace while keeping the outer shell thick and untouched. I also planned to set up some temporary screening, like a tarp draped over some poles on my side, just to further obscure our activities from any prying eyes during the construction. My heart beat a little faster with anticipation. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, though that was certainly a sweet component. It was about reclaiming my peace, my property, and asserting that I wouldn't be bullied into submission. Clarissa Thorne was about to learn a very expensive, very solid lesson about boundaries. The countdown had begun. The 2 weeks leading up to Operation Concrete Hedge were filled with a mixture of nervous excitement and meticulous preparation. I subtly thinned out the interior branches of the target section of hedge, creating a narrow, hidden corridor about 2 feet wide and 12 feet long. From the outside, from Clarissa's usual approach angle, it looked exactly the same, dense and green. From my side of the yard, if you knew where to look, You could see the carefully cleared space. I felt like a guerrilla gardener, preparing defensive fortifications. I also made several casual strolls past Clarissa's house during her usual departure and arrival times, noting her schedule. She was remarkably consistent. Out at 8:15 a.m., back around 5:45 p.m. on weekdays. Her weekend routines were less predictable, but the weekday morning shortcut was her signature move. The Friday before our planned construction weekend, Mike dropped off the concrete blocks, bags of cement mix, rebar, and a portable cement mixer. We stored everything in my garage, out of sight. That evening, I felt a little pang of, not guilt, but perhaps a final check of my conscience. Was this too much? Then I remembered her smirk, the HOA's dismissive letter, the constant destruction. No, this wasn't too much. This was exactly proportionate to the offense, a direct consequence engineered by her own relentless actions. Early Saturday morning, before the sun had even fully risen and the neighborhood was still shrouded in sleepy silence, Mike arrived. We wheeled the materials quietly to the prepared section of Hedge and put up my makeshift tarp screen on the yard side, just in case any early rising neighbors were particularly observant. Working quickly and efficiently, Mike showed me how to lay the first course of concrete blocks in a shallow trench we dug, ensuring they were level and perfectly aligned about 3 inches inside my property line. Then came the rebar, cut into sections and placed vertically into the block cavities, before we started mixing and pouring concrete to fill them. It was hard work, dusty and physically demanding, but incredibly satisfying. Every block laid, every pour of concrete, felt like a small victory. We were careful to keep our voices low, the clang of tools minimized. The rhythmic churn of the small electric cement mixer was probably the loudest noise, but it was intermittent and hopefully lost in the general early morning ambiance of a suburb starting to wake up. By midday, the first course was complete, solid, and unyielding. We let it set for a bit while we had a quick lunch, then started on the second course, staggering the blocks and adding more rebar horizontally this time, woven through the vertical supports for maximum tensile strength. Mike was a craftsman. He made sure every join was perfect, every block packed tight. "This thing ain't going anywhere," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, a satisfied grin on his face. "A tank could hit this, and the tank would be sorry." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. By late Saturday afternoon, the wall was complete, 2 courses high, 12 feet long, a solid 18 inches of reinforced concrete, now an integral, if invisible, part of my hedge. It was a beautiful, brutalist masterpiece, entirely hidden from the outside world. The top of it was still a good 6 to 8 inches below the visible top line of the denser part of the hedge. We carefully pulled the surrounding privet branches back into place, meticulously arranging them so no hint of the concrete monolith within was visible. We even scattered some fresh mulch and leaves around the base on my side to make it look undisturbed. From the path, the hedge looked exactly as it always had, perhaps even a bit fuller in that section due to my strategic fluffing of the outer branches. We cleaned up every speck of dust, every stray pebble. By the time we finished, as the sun was beginning to set, there was no outward sign of the formidable barrier lurking within. "She'll never see it coming," Mike said, stepping back to admire our handiwork. Or rather, the lack of visible evidence of it. Literally, I felt a profound sense of calm and readiness. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait. Sunday was a day of quiet anticipation. I did my usual gardening, mowed the lawn, all the while surreptitiously glancing at the reinforced section of my hedge. It looked so innocuous, so normal. Clarissa's Porsche remained parked in her driveway all day. I almost wished she'd take an impromptu Sunday drive, but patience was key. The real test would come Monday morning. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, just like any other weekday. I, however, was a bundle of nerves and excited anticipation. I positioned myself with a cup of coffee by my kitchen window, which offered a perfect, discreet view of the fateful corner of my hedge and the access path. My trail cam was fully charged and recording, its little lens hidden amongst the leaves, a silent, digital witness. At 8:13 a.m., like clockwork, the gleaming white snout of Clarissa Thorne's Porsche Cayenne appeared at the end of the access path. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. She wasn't speeding excessively, but she wasn't dawdling either. She maintained her usual pace, clearly intending to execute her signature maneuver. Her windows were tinted, but I could just make out the silhouette of her head, held high, a queen surveying her domain, completely oblivious to the unyielding surprise that awaited her. As she reached the corner, her right indicator, ironically, flashed once. Not that she was signaling to anyone, it was probably just habit. She turned the wheel, aiming for the exact spot she always cut through, the spot where soft, yielding branches used to give way. Instead, her front right tire and bumper made contact with 18 inches of solid, rebar-reinforced concrete hidden within the dense foliage. The sound was magnificent. Not a crunch of twigs, but a sickening, percussive thud, a metallic shriek of tortured steel and plastic, followed by the hiss of a deflating airbag and the tinkle of broken headlight glass. The Porsche lurched to an abrupt, violent stop, its front end visibly crumpled and canted at an odd angle, embedded firmly into the hedge which, from the outside, barely seemed to quiver. Clarissa was thrown forward against her seatbelt, then slammed back as the airbag deployed with a soft whump, filling the cabin. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, the car horn began to blare erratically, a stuck, mournful sound. Clarissa, looking dazed and utterly bewildered, fumbled with her door and stumbled out of the Porsche. Her perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, her face pale with shock, rapidly turning red with dawning fury. She stared at the front of her car, then at the hedge, then back at her car, as if unable to comprehend what had just happened. What in the... I heard her shriek, her voice cracking. She kicked the unyielding hedge with her expensive shoe, which probably hurt her foot more than the greenery. She then started pacing, shouting incoherently. Several neighbors, alerted by the crash and the blaring horn, started to emerge from their houses, Mr. Henderson among them, looking grave but with a distinct twinkle in his eye when he caught my gaze across the street. I calmly picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. Then, the HOA management company, just to be thorough. Yes, I reported, keeping my voice even. There's been a single vehicle accident on the community access path at the corner of my property. A Porsche Cayenne appears to have collided with my hedge. The driver seems okay, but the vehicle is significantly damaged and is obstructing the path. I deliberately used the word collided with my hedge, because that's exactly what it looked like from an outsider's perspective. Within minutes, a police car arrived, siren silent. Officer Miller, the same one who had patiently listened to my previous complaint about the hedge damage, stepped out. His eyes took in the scene, the wrecked Porsche, the surprisingly intact hedge, the distraught Clarissa, and the gathering crowd of onlookers. Clarissa immediately launched into a tirade. "That maniac!" she shrieked, pointing at my house. "She booby-trapped her hedge. This is an ambush. I could have been killed. I'm suing her. I'm suing the HOA. I'm suing everyone." Officer Miller listened patiently, then turned to the hedge. He examined it closely, pushing aside some outer branches. He saw nothing but dense privet. "Ma'am," he said to Clarissa, "it appears you veered off the designated pathway and struck a dense section of shrubbery on private property." Clarissa was apoplectic. "There's something in there." "She put something in there," she insisted. Officer Miller, at my invitation, stepped fully onto my property and peered deeper into the hedge from my side, where the structure wasn't as aggressively camouflaged. He could, of course, then see the top of the low concrete block wall. He looked at it, looked at my property line marker, which I had conveniently cleared of debris that morning, then looked back at Clarissa. "Ma'am, this structure, whatever it is, appears to be entirely on her property, well within her property line," he stated. "It looks like a small retaining wall or landscape feature, completely concealed by the hedge. Homeowners are generally permitted to install landscape features on their own land. The damage to your vehicle, unfortunately, appears to be the result of you leaving the roadway and striking a fixed object on private property. The air went out of Clarissa like a punctured soufflé. Her face crumpled. The HOA president, Gerald, arrived then, looking flustered and out of his depth. Clarissa immediately turned on him. "You have to do something, Gerald. She deliberately tried to destroy my car." Gerald wrung his hands. "Clarissa, if it's on her property, the bylaws." "One." He trailed off, looking utterly useless. My moment had come. I stepped forward, calm and collected. "Officer," I said, "Miss Thorne has been driving through my hedge at this exact spot for months, despite repeated requests for her to stop. I have extensive video documentation and a log of all the damages. I also have copies of my complaints to the HOA, which were dismissed. This landscape feature," I gestured to the hidden wall, "was installed entirely on my property, at my expense, to prevent further destruction of my landscaping after all other avenues failed. It is not visible from the path and conforms to all local codes for such structures within one's property boundaries." Officer Miller nodded slowly. "Well, ma'am," he said to Clarissa, "it seems this will be an expensive lesson for you. We'll need to get your insurance details and arrange for a tow truck. You'll likely be responsible for the damage to your own vehicle and potentially for any damage to Ms. Alex's property here." He gestured towards the hedge, which, miraculously, had only a few scuffs. The concrete had done its job perfectly. Clarissa looked like she was about to explode. The tow truck arrived, a massive, vulture-like vehicle. Watching her beloved, now mangled, Porsche Cayenne being ignominiously dragged away was a sight I will treasure for the rest of my days. The stuck horn had finally been silenced, and an almost surreal peace descended upon Willow Creek Estates. Mr. Henderson gave me a slow, deliberate wink from across the street. The satisfying aftermath extended for weeks. Clarissa did, of course, try to make trouble. Her insurance company initially tried to imply I was somehow at fault, but my meticulous documentation, the police report clearly stating she was off the designated roadway on private property, and the fact that my landscape feature was legal, well within my boundaries, and not inherently a hazard if one didn't drive into it, quickly shut them down. Her claim against me was denied. In fact, her insurance had to pay me a small sum for damage to landscape, a few scuffed branches and the replacement of some mulch. The irony was delicious. She also tried to rally the HOA board against me, demanding they force me to remove my dangerous hidden wall. However, armed with my property survey, photos, videos of her transgressions, and the police report, even the normally spineless Gerald couldn't find grounds to support her. The board, facing potential liability if they tried to overstep onto my clear property rights, meekly concluded that I had acted within my rights to protect my property. Clarissa Thorne was, for once, powerless. She had to pay a hefty deductible for her Porsche repairs, her insurance premiums skyrocketed, and she was the subject of much neighborhood gossip, none of it flattering. She eventually resigned as HOA treasurer, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew it was because her authority, much like her Porsche's front end, had been permanently crumpled. The best part? She never, ever cut that corner again. In fact, she started taking the long way around the neighborhood, avoiding my street altogether. My hedge, with its secret concrete spine, grew back thicker and more beautiful than ever, a quiet monument to persistence and perfectly executed revenge. So, if you're out there dealing with your own HOA Karen, remember this. Sometimes, the most satisfying solutions are the ones you build yourself, firmly on your own property, and just wait for karma to drive right into them. Drop a comment if you've ever had to get creative to defend your little patch of peace.